The Kepler place has been dead and buried for 20 years, Marisol. It's 70 acres of nothing but useless weeds, thorny brambles, and total ruin. Those were the exact words spoken to her, but in the early spring of 2025, a 34-year-old former restaurant manager named Marisol Doyle ignored the warnings and officially purchased 70 acres of severely neglected farmland situated on the outer rural edges of Franklin County, Pennsylvania. She secured the property for an astonishingly low price, so ridiculously cheap, in fact, that the county clerk handling the paperwork stopped, looked up over her glasses, and asked her twice if she had actually read the sale listing correctly before signing her name. The property was a testament to time and abandonment. It featured an old wooden barn leaning at a precarious, alarming angle, an ancient, rusted International harvester tractor that had not turned over or coughed to life in decades, and a dilapidated greenhouse containing vastly more shattered glass than intact panes. Beyond the structural decay lay acres of pastures so choked with wild brush, dense thickets, and opportunistic volunteer trees that the original perimeter fence lines had completely vanished beneath a thick blanket of more than 10 years of unmitigated neglect. Nearly everyone who caught wind of her impulsive purchase offered her the exact same grim assessment, expressed in one discouraging variation or another. The consensus was overwhelming. The parcel was simply far too vast for a single person to manage on her own. It was too far gone, too deeply degraded, to ever be restored to productivity without an enormous fortune, a fortune Marisol quite obviously did not possess. Skeptics warned that she would easily burn through an entire year's worth of personal savings just clearing out the dense undergrowth before she ever managed to plant a single row of viable crops. Marisol had been listening to various iterations of that very same pessimistic speech her entire adult life. Mostly, those lectures came from well-meaning friends, acquaintances, and strangers who meant no harm, but who had also never once taken a leap of faith or attempted to build something meaningful from the ground up. Before taking this massive gamble, she had spent 12 long, exhausting years managing busy, high-volume restaurants in downtown Harrisburg. During those years, she had watched talented chefs and great kitchens live or die based entirely on the fickle reliability and quality of their produce distributors. Somewhere during the final stretch of that career, thoroughly weary of paying exorbitant, premium prices for tired vegetables that had been hauled in diesel trucks from 3 states away, a subtle spark had ignited within her. She began to dream obsessively about cultivating the food herself rather than merely arranging it on porcelain plates. The rundown property she had acquired had originally belonged to an old farmer named Elmer Kepler. Elmer had devoted close to half a century of hard, physical labor to those fields before severe arthritis and the relentless march of old age finally forced him to retire in his late 80s. When he eventually passed away, his grown children, none of whom inherited a single drop of his passion for working the land, eagerly partitioned the farm and sold off the property in separate parcels. The final 70 acres, which happened to be the most isolated, topographically challenging, and heavily overgrown section of the original homestead, sat dormant on the open real estate market for the better part of 2 full years. That was until Marisol stepped forward with a modest, daring offer that no one else in the region had been willing to make. Her initial week living and working on the property taught her more practical, hard-hitting lessons than every single agricultural manual and farming book she had feverishly devoured over the preceding 12 months. The sprawling pastures, left entirely unmanaged for well over a decade, had undergone a complete ecological transformation. What was once open, fertile grassland had devolved into a dense, impenetrable labyrinth of sharp multiflora rose bushes, aggressive autumn olive shrubs, and wild ash saplings. In many places, the brush grew so thick and tall that Marisol found herself completely enveloped, unable to see more than 20 feet in any direction. The greenhouse, while structurally sound in its heavy wooden framing, presented a massive restoration challenge. Virtually every single glass panel was cracked or completely shattered, and more than half of the subterranean irrigation pipes running through its length had split open from years of harsh winter freezes and sudden spring thaws. Furthermore, the main barn leaned so dramatically toward the east that a local building contractor, called out to inspect the site, plainly informed her that the structure would require immediate, costly structural shoring before she could safely store anything of actual value inside its shadow. Then there was the tractor. The aged, sun-faded International harvester that had been thrown in with the land sat motionless in the exact spot where Elmer Kepler had apparently parked it for the last time decades ago. Its heavy rubber tires were dry-rotted and completely flat, its cast-iron engine was thoroughly seized tight with rust, and field mice had shredded what little remained of the vinyl seat cushion to build generations of cozy nests. During that strenuous first week, a neighboring cattle rancher named Dwayne Fedoroff, who had spent 30 years successfully farming the adjoining property, paused his afternoon routine to stop by. He leaned against his truck, took one long, unvarnished look at the seized, rusted machine, and offered Marisol his candid advice without a shred of diplomacy. He told her flatly that she would be far better off scrapping the relic and buying a functioning tractor outright rather than throwing away good money and precious energy trying to resurrect a piece of iron that was clearly beyond saving. Marisol smiled politely, thanked him sincerely for his neighborly opinion, and immediately returned to her grueling work. Long before she had ever signed the final stack of closing documents on the deed, Marisol had made a firm, unshakable decision. She had absolutely no intention of farming the land the way Elmer Kepler had worked it, nor did she plan to replicate the conventional methods utilized by most of her new neighbors. Throughout her final year of managing dining rooms in Harrisburg, she had immersed herself in the study of regenerative agriculture. She spent her late nights reading everything she could find regarding cover cropping, high-density rotational grazing, and the biological art of restoring depleted soil health from the ground up, rather than relying on the heavy synthetic inputs that surrounding farmers had depended on for decades. It was an innovative, ecology-minded philosophy that had been steadily gaining traction among smaller, forward-thinking agricultural operations across the country. It appealed immensely to producers desperately searching for ways to dramatically slash their overhead expenses while building natural biological resilience into land that had been severely degraded by skyrocketing prices for commercial fertilizers, chemical herbicides, diesel fuel, and every other costly input required by modern, conventional row crop farming. Marisol simply did not have the massive liquid capital required to farm in the traditional, capital-intensive manner, even if she had desired to do so. What she did possess in abundance was time, an indomitable streak of stubbornness, and a deep-seated, genuine conviction that the living earth buried beneath all that tangled brush was fundamentally better, richer, and more capable than anyone driving past it on the county road currently assumed. Dwayne Fedoroff's open skepticism, as it turned out, was remarkably representative of how the rest of the local township viewed her ambitious undertaking. Down at the local feed and seed store, gossip traveled fast. It took very little time for the word to spread that the old Kepler place had been bought by a city woman who used to manage high-end restaurants and had never spent a single day of her life behind the wheel of a tractor or holding the reins of a farm. The general consensus, repeated in hushed tones over steaming mugs of coffee at the town diner and murmured in the parking lot after church services every Sunday, was remarkably uniform. The inexperienced newcomer would inevitably burn through her modest life savings within a single year, and the neglected 70 acres would wind up right back on the auction block by the following spring, this time listed at an even lower, more desperate price than she had paid for it. Undeterred by the quiet town gossip, Marisol spent the humid months of her first summer immersed in the brutal, unglamorous physical labor that nobody ever bothered to romanticize. Day after agonizing day, she cleared heavy brush entirely by hand and with the help of a heavy-duty rented brush hog mower. She worked systematically, section by painstaking section, across expansive pastures that had been completely abandoned for so long that the underlying soil had been squeezed into something resembling solid concrete, particularly in the shaded areas where Elmer Kepler's cattle had once clustered around old feeding troughs decades prior. Simultaneously, she tackled the greenhouse project. She painstakingly replaced the broken glass panes one by one, sourcing salvage glass in bulk from an architectural supply yard located 2 counties away in order to keep her meager budget intact. She rebuilt the fractured, freeze-damaged irrigation lines entirely by herself, spending late nights studying instructional repair videos until she gained enough confidence to cut, glue, and fit the PVC pipes with her own hands. Resurrecting the ancient tractor, however, proved to be a far more formidable hurdle than anything else on the property. Marisol had virtually no background in mechanical repair or engine maintenance. Yet, her luck began to shift when she met Walt Seek, a soft-spoken, retired diesel mechanic who operated a modest, independent repair shop just outside the town limits. Walt's interest was instantly piqued when Marisol walked into his office carrying detailed, close-up photographs of the frozen International harvester engine, asking for a realistic estimate of what it would cost to get the machine operational once more. Walt initially quoted her a standard price for the intensive labor required if she chose to haul the machine directly to his shop. However, as he looked over the photos, he paused, tilted his head, and offered a thoughtful alternative almost as an afterthought. He mentioned that if she was truly willing to roll up her sleeves and learn the greasy, difficult mechanics herself rather than simply writing a check for his time, he would be more than happy to mentor her through the entire overhaul process on weekends for a mere fraction of his usual fee. Marisol did not hesitate for a second to accept his generous proposition. Throughout the sweltering weekends of July and August, the two of them could be found huddled over the dismantled engine block inside the cool shade of Walt's workshop. Under Walt's patient, expert supervision, Marisol learned the delicate art of freeing a stubborn, rust-seized piston, flushing and cleaning a contaminated fuel system, and completely rebuilding a complex carburetor with her own grease-stained hands. By early September, the labor yielded its sweet reward. The old International harvester sputtered, coughed a cloud of dark smoke, and roared to life on its second crank. With a triumphant smile, Marisol personally drove the vintage green tractor back to her farm. The engine ran a bit rough, but it proved remarkably steady as she rumbled past Dwayne Fedorov's pristine property line at a slow, deliberate crawl. Slow enough that Dwayne himself actually dropped his tools, stepped out of his barn, and walked all the way down to his boundary fence just to watch the miraculous procession in silent disbelief. That very same autumn, the greenhouse was finally fully restored to peak working condition. Marisol immediately utilized the climate-controlled space to prepare for her very first serious planting season the following spring. Rather than focusing on low-margin, high-volume wholesale commodity markets, she carefully selected a highly diversified, vibrant mix of specialty heirloom vegetables. Her target market consisted of the precise network of high-end, farm-to-table restaurants back in Harrisburg, establishments where she still maintained deep, trust-filled professional relationships from her previous career. In many ways, this specific element of her broader business plan was the one piece that made absolute, undeniable sense to anyone in town who bothered to actually speak with her directly, rather than merely repeating idle gossip spun at the feed store. Marisol possessed an intimate, insider knowledge of the industry. She knew precisely which executive chefs required which exotic greens, root vegetables, and edible flowers, down to the exact week of the growing season, simply because she had spent over a decade sitting on the opposite side of that exact transaction, meticulously placing those very same orders week after week. While the vegetable production took off inside the greenhouse, the restoration of the broad pastures took on an entirely different, complex dynamic. This phase of her master plan was guided heavily by a professional rotational grazing consultant named Priscilla Whitmore, whom Marisol had hired for a single, highly detailed on-site consultation that spring. Priscilla was an expert employed by the County Conservation District, specializing in helping small-scale, struggling farm operations make the ecological transition toward sustainable, regenerative land management practices. On a bright morning, Priscilla walked the newly cleared fields alongside Marisol, carefully evaluating the degree of soil compaction, identifying the remaining native forage grasses, and assessing natural water access across the topography. Together, they mapped out a streamlined, highly effective rotational grazing framework. The system relied on lightweight, highly portable electric fencing to move a small, modest starter herd of 12 beef cattle through the expansive property in tight, densely clustered, frequently shifted paddocks. This specific methodology was deliberately designed to mimic the natural, historical behavior of wild, nomadic grazing herds, such as bison, that had once traversed the American landscape in tight, protective formations, grazing intensely for brief periods before moving on to fresh ground, long before modern fences existed. This stood in sharp contrast to the traditional method of continuous grazing, where cattle were left turned out in a single large pasture for months at a time, allowing them to selectively overgraze their favorite grasses down to the roots while leaving the soil exposed, trampled, and vulnerable to severe erosion. Adopting this intense rotational system demanded a far greater commitment of Marisol's daily physical time than any traditional setup ever would. During the height of the warm growing season, she found herself out in the fields physically breaking down and setting up new temporary fence lines nearly every single day. However, what the system demanded in daily physical effort, it made up for by requiring virtually zero financial expenditure on expensive commercial inputs, chemical fertilizers, or imported supplemental feed. The biological results were nothing short of remarkable. By the conclusion of that very first full grazing season, Priscilla returned to take a series of comprehensive soil core samples. The lab tests revealed a staggering improvement. Organic matter levels were actively climbing across pastures that had been severely compacted, degraded, and stripped of vital nutrients for decades under Elmer Kepler's late-stage, physically limited management. It was a quiet, gradual, and completely unglamorous form of progress, the subtle kind of ecological healing that rarely translated into a dramatic, eye-catching before and after photo for a local newspaper. Yet, it was profound progress that could be measured, felt, and celebrated by the living soil itself, even if the neighboring farmers driving past her fences on the county road could not yet visually perceive the transformation. However, the extraordinary discovery that ultimately reshaped how the entire township talked about the old Kepler place occurred almost entirely by accident right in the middle of that hot summer grazing season. Marisol was conducting a routine perimeter check when she noticed a strikingly vibrant, lush green patch of dense vegetation thriving in an isolated corner of her lower pasture. What made the sight so incredibly jarring was that it was occurring right in the middle of a brutal, unforgiving July heatwave, a severe dry spell that had baked the surrounding soil dry and turned the vast majority of her property an unsightly, crispy brown. Intrigued and deeply curious, Marisol waded through the high grass toward the anomaly. There, almost entirely buried beneath decades of compacted leaf litter, rotting logs, and dense, thorny brush, she stumbled upon an ancient spring box. The structure was a sturdy, forgotten relic made of hand-poured concrete, originally engineered to capture, hold, and channel natural underground spring water. Based on the sheer volume of wild undergrowth that had swallowed the concrete walls, the structure had clearly been capped, abandoned, and forgotten long before Elmer Kepler had ever set foot on the property. Marisol happened to mention her curious finding to Dwayne Fedoroff later that week, simply because he was the neighbor she ran into most frequently near the roadside mailboxes. To her surprise, despite Dwayne's persistent, open skepticism regarding her non-traditional farming methods, the veteran rancher displayed a sudden, genuine fascination with this specific revelation. He accompanied her back out to the lower pasture to inspect the structure firsthand. After scraping away moss and studying the thick, vintage concrete work, Dwayne explained that localized spring boxes of that specific design had been exceptionally common across regional farms a century ago, long before modern agricultural operations universally transitioned toward deep-drilled electric groundwater wells. He looked at her intently and emphasized that a reliable, self-sustaining spring capturing pure, cool groundwater at such a significant volume, especially in a county that had been wrestling with rapidly dropping water tables, severe restrictions, and increasingly erratic rainfall patterns over recent summers, was worth infinitely more than most local folk driving past her gate would ever comprehend. Without delay, Marisol dedicated 2 full weekends that August to properly restoring the historical water source. She cleared away the dense debris, repaired a cracked, leaking section of the original concrete collection basin with fresh masonry, and installed a simple, highly efficient gravity-fed pipeline extending down to a brand-new stock watering tank situated lower in the pasture. This elegant, low-tech setup provided her growing cattle herd with an endless, crystal-clear supply of fresh drinking water. Best of all, it operated completely independent of the township's overburdened, increasingly expensive municipal water supply, a municipal grid that several neighboring farms had been forced to rely on at tremendous financial expense during the driest stretches of recent summers. Almost incidentally, the ancient spring solved one of the most agonizing, persistent worries Marisol had carried since buying the land: how to maintain a viable operation in a drought-prone region where the soaring costs of both commercial hay and trucked water were rapidly pushing traditional pasture-based farms to the absolute brink of financial ruin. News of the functional, resurrected spring traveled through the farming community at a speed that far outpaced any previous discussions regarding her rotational grazing experiments or greenhouse crops. The sudden interest was simple: severe water scarcity was a terrifying, immediate threat that every single farmer in Franklin County understood on a visceral, personal level, regardless of their individual opinions on soil biology or modern regenerative agricultural philosophies. Dwayne Fedoroff himself, who had been forced to spend thousands of dollars hauling massive water tanks to his own thirsty cattle for 2 consecutive summers during the peak of the drought, approached Marisol with a humble, complete absence of his former condescension. He quietly asked her if she thought there might possibly be a similar lost spring buried somewhere on his own sprawling acreage, hidden beneath decades of altered drainage patterns and forgotten agricultural history. Intrigued by the challenge, the 2 neighbors spent a long, pleasant Saturday afternoon in mid-September walking Dwayne's expansive land. Armed with a yellowed, fragile aerial survey map that Dwayne's late father had preserved from decades prior, they carefully traced the natural contours of the terrain. Near his northern boundary line, they discovered undeniable, clear geological evidence of what had almost certainly been a second high-volume spring. The natural water source had been capped and buried back in the mid-1960s, an era when extensive underground tile drainage systems had swept through the region as the hot new agricultural trend, and naturally wet, low-lying field spots were routinely treated as inconvenient nuisances to be drained and paved over rather than precious, life-giving natural resources to be preserved and managed. By the time the 1-year anniversary of Marisol's daring land purchase arrived the following spring, the overarching narrative surrounding the old Kepler place had undergone a complete, astonishing transformation. The once shattered greenhouse was now operating at maximum, vibrant capacity, continuously supplying 3 of Harrisburg's premier farm-to-table dining establishments with a fresh, rotating bounty of high-grade, organically grown specialty vegetables throughout the entire season. The sprawling pastures, while still showing the delicate, honest scars of long-term recovery, were undeniably greener, more lush, and remarkably more productive than they had ever been during Elmer Kepler's final, physically exhausted years of management. The revitalized soil was now effortlessly sustaining a healthy cattle herd that had expanded from her original 12 head to 20 vibrant animals, all without requiring a single extra pound of expensive, store-bought grain or imported feed. The restored International Harvester tractor fired up smoothly and reliably every time she turned the key, serving as her primary workhorse for routine field operations across the property. It was a deep source of personal pride for Marisol, a triumph she delighted in sharing with Walt Seek whenever the retired mechanic drove his old pickup truck down her driveway to check on his former student and admire how his engine repair lessons were holding up in the field. Furthermore, the restored concrete spring, flowing continuously in the lower pasture, had evolved into a celebrated local landmark and subject of widespread curiosity. The success of her simple gravity-fed system had already inspired at least 2 other prominent township farmers, in addition to Dwayne, to begin re-examining their own historical land deeds and drainage maps, wondering how many other long-lost water sources lay hidden beneath fields that modern farming conventions had foolishly written off decades ago. When a local farmer down at the feed store brought up the topic and reminded Dwayne Fedoroff of the harsh, pessimistic predictions he had uttered when Marisol first arrived in the county, the seasoned cattle rancher didn't hesitate or offer excuses. He looked his peer dead in the eye and openly admitted that he had been completely wrong about almost every single assumption he had made a year prior. He explained that he had fully expected the entire venture to end in a catastrophic financial collapse driven by naive overreach, viewing Marisol as an inexperienced city woman with zero agricultural background, trying to accomplish too much too fast on a piece of land that was simply too far gone to ever be saved. What he had witnessed instead over the preceding 12 months was a remarkably steady, deeply calculated, and quiet form of success unlike anything he had seen in his 40 years of farming. It was a triumph built not on a single, flashy miracle or massive injection of capital, but rather on an uninterrupted year of backbreaking, unglamorous, and infinitely patient labor that had cumulatively transformed 70 acres of abandoned ruin into a thriving, highly profitable, and ecologically resilient farm. Whenever people brought up her remarkable achievements, Marisol herself never framed her successful first year as any sort of smug victory over the local doubters who had gossiped about her at the diner. Instead, whenever asked about the turnaround, she spoke passionately and humbly about soil microbes, organic matter accumulation, precise paddock rotation schedules, and the profound, deeply moving personal satisfaction she felt watching a chef at a restaurant she used to manage plate a fresh, beautiful salad grown entirely from seed she had nurtured in a greenhouse she had personally rebuilt with her own bare hands. Yet, beneath her humble, practical explanations burned the exact same fierce, uncompromising instinct that had compelled her to abandon a comfortable, stable management career in the city in the first place, an unshakable, quiet conviction that 70 acres of abused, forgotten, and overgrown earth still held something immensely valuable buried deep within its heart. Just waiting for someone patient, tough, and loving enough to clear away everything that didn't belong, and uncover the beauty that did. Now, as the early morning sun crests the rolling hills of Franklin County, the clean glass windows of the restored greenhouse catch the golden morning light in the exact same glowing manner Elmer Kepler had likely watched them catch it decades ago, long before advancing age and severe arthritis rendered the physical labor too overwhelming for him to maintain. Down in the equipment shed, the old green International harvester roars to life on the very first try, its engine humming smooth and true. And out in the quiet solitude of the lower pasture, pure, clear groundwater that had remained trapped, buried, and forgotten beneath the earth for the better part of a century continues to flow steady and strong into a full-stock tank. A life-giving oasis that has not run dry a single time, not even during the absolute hottest, driest stretches of a relentless summer that had left half the county desperately hauling water just to keep their own livestock alive.